Welcome back! Today we're going to be looking at a really fantastic medieval poem called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This poem was originally written in about 1400 by an unknown poet, and the language is that fun Middle English. It's definitely a challenge for the modern English reader, even if you are good enough to read something like Chaucer, because some of the northern dialect and vocabulary in this book can be very puzzling. The poetry itself reflects the old techniques of the alliteration of the Anglo-Saxon period with the newer technique of rhyme that came with the introduction of Romance language into Middle English after the Battle of Hastings. Old English relied very heavily upon alliteration because the first syllables of most of the words were accented. But in Romance languages, the last syllable tends to be accented, so that rhyme is a more reasonable poetic technique. This poem blends the two of them. You get these meaty stanzas full of alliteration that end with what we call a bob and wheel. One very short line followed by a quatrain of rhyming lines. And so it becomes sort of a marriage between the Old and Middle English. These linguistic challenges certainly delight, but they also pose some problems. For example, it's a little hard to decide how exactly to pronounce the hero's name. Frequently, his name is alliterated within the poem, which seems to indicate that the first syllable should be stressed, Gawain. But his name occasionally shows up within the bob and wheel with some indication that there might be a stress on the second syllable, Gawain. When I first studied this poem in college, my professor always called him Gawain. But the more I studied it, the more confused I got, so I tend to change pronunciations every time, which is terrible. I try to shoot for the middle ground Gawain, but I often will mix up and say it not exactly how I intend. So expect me to pronounce it all kinds of different ways throughout this video on accident. I apologize in advance. But the difficulty in pronouncing the main character's name does not take away from the excellence of this poem. This poem is rich and delightful. It's the story of a testing of a good knight. Someone who's got very strong character being put to the test. And so it's an examination of heroism and heroic qualities. Can virtue really hold up to its standard? Throughout this poem there is a repeated image of standing for virtue, being tempted, succumbing, and confessing. The overarching plot functions in that way, but there are also repeated images of that cycle throughout the entire poem. For anyone who's interested in their own character growth and trying to live up to a certain standard, this poem is for you. But it's also about what it means to mess up and recover from your mistakes, which makes it perfectly applicable even today. Sir Gawain is a character who steps up to face a challenge that no one else will step up for. Because he has the courage to step up and face challenges, he is tested. And although he doesn't come out of this completely unscathed, and although he is not completely perfect in this process, the fact that he stands up in the first place means that he has had a success. The other knights failed from the get-go simply by not accepting the trial. It's also important to notice throughout this poem that there are explicit temptations, and there are also subtle temptations. And we discover along the way that sometimes, although the explicit temptations are easy to avoid, it's the subtle ones that catch us off guard. I'm going to give a quick summary of the poem, but I'd like to follow this video with a close examination of each of the 4 parts of the poem later on. The poem begins with a celebration from Christmas to New Year's in King Arthur's court, when all of a sudden the court is interrupted by a gigantic green knight who offers a challenge. Rather than the usual or very sensible games that people play at Christmas time, the knight offers a head-chopping challenge, offering his axe to whoever would like to strike off his head. Whoever accepts this challenge will then in return receive a stroke from the Green Knight 1 year later. This is a bizarre challenge, especially since how are you going to be able to give a stroke after you've had your head chopped off? But it turns out that the Green Knight is something of a mysterious and ghostly figure. When Gawain steps up to accept the challenge and to honor his lord King Arthur, he chops off the knight's head, but the knight simply picks his head up off the ground and then gives him instructions on how to find him the next year. And so now Gawain not only had to have the courage to try out this bizarre challenge, but he also now has the courage to go and face the Green Knight a year later. The year begins to pass, and eventually Gawain realizes that he needs to take the trip. And so he says goodbye to the court and he rides out to find the Green Knight. Everywhere he searches, there is no sign of the Green Knight. But finally, as he gets very close to the deadline, on Christmas Day, he stumbles across a castle where he stops to say mass and celebrate and ask directions. The people of the castle gladly take him in, and they tell him that the Green Chapel where the Green Knight lives is only 2 miles away, and so he can celebrate with them for the holidays, and they'll show him the way at New Year's Day. And so Sir Gawain stays with them for the next week. After the celebration is over, with only 3 days left, the master of the house offers a game to Sir Gawain. The master will go out on the hunt every day, and whatever he wins, he will give to Sir Gawain. In return, Sir Gawain will have to give the master of the house whatever he wins in the court. And so we begin an examination of courtly love versus the chase. The next 3 days, there's a clear parallel between what happens in the house and what happens out in the woods during the hunt. The master of the house hunts a bunch of deer, and then a boar, and then a fox. Meanwhile, Sir Gawain is clearly being pursued by the lady of the house. He has to uphold his courteous, knightly nature while staving off her advances. And he manages to keep himself pure for the first few days, receiving only those chaste kisses which are acceptable in the culture, which he then passes off as winnings to the master of the house, in return for the trophies of the hunt. It's not till the 3rd day that Sir Gawain succumbs to temptation. The lady, recognizing that he will never love her, offers him a present to remember her by. In fact, she offers a beautiful red gold ring, but when he refuses it, she offers him a green girdle. This green girdle, she says, holds a special power that keeps the wearer from being injured. This finally tempts Sir Gawain into taking it. After all, this just might be the thing that helps him survive his encounter with the Green Knight. And so he does not keep his word and give it to the master of the house as one of his winnings. New Year's Day arrives, and Sir Gawain rides out to the Green Chapel, where he finds the giant Green Knight sharpening his axe. The Green Knight is terrifying, and the Green Chapel seems like a hellish place, but Sir Gawain bravely accepts the consequences of the match that he started last year. He bares his neck and prepares to have his head chopped off. The Green Knight fakes twice. The first time, Sir Gawain flinches, but the second time he holds strong. Finally, the Green Knight takes a 3rd swipe at his neck and nicks it rather than chopping his head off. Sir Gawain jumps up and says the terms of the deal have been met, and then he's ready to fight. But the Green Knight reveals that all of this, from the beginning, was a test. It turns out that the Green Knight is actually the master of the house in disguise, charmed by the fairy Morgan Le Fay. The first 2 axe swings were because he had been faithful during those first 2 days and had given all of his winnings to the master of the house and had kept himself from temptation. But the 3rd time, he received a nick in his neck because he had kept the green girdle. However, the Green Knight, though punishing him lightly, tells him that that was the least of the crimes he could have committed. He did it only to save his life, not out of some worse motivation, and therefore it is somewhat excusable. Sir Gawain is very shamed, and he recognizes that his honor has been tarnished by his actions. He should have kept his word. He always prided himself in keeping his word, and had kept his word in the contest with the Green Knight, but he'd failed to keep his word in the contest with the master of the house. And so, now chastened and taught a lesson, he goes home wearing the green girdle, which he vows to always wear from now on to help keep him from pride and to recognize his fault. In that way, it becomes a kind of permanent confession, recognizing his weakness and keeping it as a reminder to keep him from falling again. That's the general gist of the poem, but it has layers upon layers of rich symbolism and imagery and other wonderful things. I'd like to examine all of that over the next 4 videos, where I look at each of the 4 parts of the poem. And I hope you'll come back and explore those with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.